One way you can make a typographic composition look refined is by defining a structure for the space on its page or its screen that aligns elements to the composition of this structure. And in typography, this structure is called a grid. People have been using grids of one kind or another since the earliest days of printing and even before. In traditional Chinese manuscripts, for instance, text is arranged in columns of equal width and each character takes up a perfectly square space within each column. In medieval Europe, the pages of books were sometimes laid out with the margins that were defined by the golden ratio, a special mathematical proportion. Scribes and later typesetters often used systems of lines to measure out these margins. They noticed that the systems that were creating the margins are often different depending on the top, bottom, left, and right sides of the page. And this created a composition with dynamic rather than a static feel. The proportions of the golden ratio, roughly 1.618, continue to inform typographic composition into the 20th century. Jan Teshold, the German typographer who advocated for sans serif type in the 1920s, studied medieval manuscripts and often applied the golden ratio to his compositions. In this poster from 1938, for instance, Teshold arranged elements in a relationship to each other based on a structure of that ratio. In the mid-20th century, designers of the Neo-Graphique movement of Switzerland refined the use of a grid by creating highly organized visual structures. Here's a poster by Joseph Müller-Brockmann from 1955. And here's a page spread from Neo-Graphique of the publication. Defining and using a grid can help you create compositions that feel visually refined. Grids are particularly useful in publications where they can help each of the spreads feel like they belong with the next. So let's look at some of the elements that make up a classic page grid. Margins define the borders of the main printed area within a page. If you're setting up margins for a book, it's important to remember that the inside margins correspond to the spine, so depending on how the publication will be bound, it's a good idea to make the margins plenty generous. Some layouts use a hang line. This is the point of the page where, for instance, text and new chapters might begin. Large format publications often use multiple columns so that the line length can be kept reasonable. Often, those columns are in turn subdivided so that the designer has the flexibility to create blocks of text of different widths, some spanning several columns. The space between columns is called the gutter, and it's often the width of the gutter that's set to the size of the type's leading. Finally, a baseline grid can be used to make sure that lines of text and the adjacent columns on succeeding pages line up with one another. Today, grids are almost everywhere that typography is. They're on the web, they're actually built into a CSS, and a popular website grid, like the one used on the right of the grid system, is 960 pixels with 6, 12, and 16 columns across. Grids are a really useful tool. Still, if they're used incorrectly or just too much, they can limit or constrain your compositions. So I'd recommend always starting a composition without a grid. And then once you've figured out what you want to do, go back and reverse engineer the grid so that it helps you refine the alignment and makes distances nice and consistent. And always remember that there is plenty of instances where a grid may not be necessary or even appropriate at all.